Oh my goodness, so many people here. Supposedly this is also the first talk, and I'm very excited to kick it off, basically. So, this talk today is, well, as the title says, how to game jam as a 2D artist. It's a very practical guide, and I hope there's going to be something for everyone, even if this is your first game jam ever. But also if you've done it many times or even just a few times, I hope that either it's going to be a good refresher for some good things to keep in mind as we get started with Nordic Game Jam this weekend. But also, yeah, I think kind of leaning a bit into why I think it's really good regardless of whether you are maybe aspiring to become a concept artist or a 2D artist in general. I hope there's something for everyone here, because I think there's something very beautiful about the fact that almost all of us, like since we're kids, like have at least a vague understanding of how to draw, even if it's just a stick man. So I really hope there's going to be something useful for each and every one of you, regardless of the role that you might have for this game jam. As mentioned before, my name is Juliane Norske, and I am a concept artist at SYBO. And without further ado, I will just talk a little bit about my background. I have been game jamming since 2012. Back in the day, since I was a kid, I loved to play games, I loved to draw. And then at some point in 2012, I discovered that there's this thing called game jams. And I attended one for like young teens here in Denmark. And it was a summer course. And that was the first time I tried how to make a game, and I realized combining my love for drawing and video games just fit together so well. So it just kind of gave me a taste for like, oh, it would be really fun to work in the games industry when I grow up. And I figured out like, wait, is this actually something you can do? I started meeting people who like were in the games industry or wanted to get into the games industry, and it was just so inspiring. So ever since that, I've just been attending game jams regularly. It's a really good way to stay creative and step out of your comfort zone, all that kind of good stuff. So I kind of sought a path towards working with games somehow. And in hindsight, I don't really know why, but I ended up taking a career or starting a bachelor degree at graphic storytelling at the animation workshop, which is a very fancy way of saying a comics degree. So during 4 years, I made a lot of comics, and that was very different. But I think the reason why I want to highlight that for this presentation is to show that you can have many different paths into game development. It's luckily an industry that really benefits mostly from just showing that you want to stay creative regardless of your role and background, and that as long as you have a passion for games and like have an open mindset to creating games, then hopefully that can lead you into working with games somehow, if that's something you're interested in, or even if you're just here to try it out and see if it's something for you. So after I graduated in 21, I started an internship at SYBO, and then eventually I joined the Subway Surfers team. Maybe some of you have played Subway Surfers either recently or maybe 12-something years ago when the game was first released. Fun fact, the people who started SYBO actually graduated from the animation workshop as well, so that was also founded by people who worked in animation industry. So people have very different backgrounds in the games industry, and I think that's also why it's really a fun and creative industry. So that's a bit about my day job, but really I'm here to talk about game jams, and hopefully with some of the knowledge I have from both game jamming and working in the game industry professionally, you can get something from this talk. So without further ado, let's get to team compositions. I want to start out with this because it's very important to know that depending on both the size of your team, but also who is part of that team, things will change a bit. I will cover some aspects of it. I will not talk so much about sound design, just FYI, but mostly like graphics and maybe combination with how it relates to programming, or not doing that so much. I will also cover that a little bit. But really the most important thing is that I will also hopefully give some good tips on how you can be an awesome team player, or just be a good team for yourself as well. So I will start with team-based projects because I know there's probably going to be a lot of you who go and join this jam as part of a team, either one made already, or maybe you're going to meet some awesome people that you can make a game together with. I also really recommend that. One of the most important things, and this is not a scientific graph by any means, I just kind of made it based on my own experiences jamming for a few years, and that is it's really important to know that the workloads can and will shift as you go into this weekend. I think one of the most important things to start out with when you're game jamming as a team is to set expectations with each other. Talk about the ambition you have for the game, but also really be honest about like when you guys need a break. If you know that you're the kind of person who needs frequent breaks, tell your team that so that no one starts to feel like bad for having maybe extra needs for taking rest and breaks. It's really important to like make sure that you also feel healthy at the end of this game jam. Like even just completely practical things like, are you the kind of person who likes to work late? Do you want to wake up early? All those kind of things, talk about it beforehand. It's so important. And then as a 2D artist, what I often experience is that you will probably be super busy at the beginning of the jam, and then eventually like you've created enough assets that you can start to step back a bit. Meanwhile, from my experience, it's not always the case, but from my experience, programmers tend to be extra busy leading up to the deadline because there's a lot of builds that needs to work. You discover some bugs, maybe someone just play tested your game and you found a game-breaking thing, and then all of a sudden your programmer is like sweating and being like, God, how can we get this ready? But eventually the deadline will be met, and then hopefully everyone can kind of let go of that pressure and things will be good again. It's a tiny pro tip, but I think it's also good to keep in mind. But if you are, for example, the 2D artist on your team, Sunday is a really good day to update your itch.io pages with screenshots of your games. If you have any like nice splash screens you want to share, do that on Sunday. It will help your team a lot, and that way you can always look back on the game you make and look at some of the beautiful things you've made, and then you also have, you know, a page that you can share with your friends and family after the game jam is over. So that's a little bit about team-based projects. I will also say as a little extra thing about this, starting, if this is your first game jam, it's really good to try working as a team maybe to start with. More people is not necessarily better, but I think it's also just good to try some different things as you hopefully want to do more game jams in the future. I also want to talk a little bit about solo projects, just from the perspective of a 2D artist. And I think this is especially maybe good to keep in mind if you have done a few game jams. But also, I think it can be very intimidating, the idea of making a game by yourself, because all of a sudden you're on your own. You need to set your own expectations. But luckily in this modern day and age, you can actually make games without necessarily knowing any programming skills, even in Unity. I have tried to make a game personally in Unity with things called microgames that you can search for on Unity. These are basically ready-made packages that you can play with, almost like Lego pieces. Like a lot of the things already work for you. So let's say if you want to make a first-person shooter, for example, then you kind of have a template for that. It can be really fun to play around with, even in Unity. Like a lot of things just work out of the box when you know how to search for it, basically, on the asset store. And then there's also things like Construct 3, RPG Maker, or Game Boy Studio, which was apparently also made during a game jam. I think that's really cool. These are also really fun options to work with kind of engines that are already like made to be very visual and easy to understand. They're really nice to work with during game jams, from my experience. So these are also worth checking out. If you want to go a bit more off the charted path, you can also make games with things like PowerPoint or Google Slides. Essentially, they can kind of work in the same way that once you know how to attach a link to something in a presentation, then you can, for example, make a point-and-click game or a dating simulator or whatever choose-your-own-adventure kind of game. You can actually do that in PowerPoint. So working with those limitations you have when you don't necessarily know how to program for solo projects, it will help you so much. So I've also mentioned that, like I said before, this is probably really fun. It's fun to try if you've tried a few game jams before and you sometimes feel a bit stuck in your role. I've often felt that way, that like, okay, I'm really good at drawing, but I also want to design a game with the vision I have. And this is a really good way to kind of get out of that role if you feel a bit stuck in that. And that can actually also go, for example, if you're a sound designer, maybe that can be worth trying out just to see what can I do with all the creative limitations that I actually have. And I think also on that note, regardless of your role and team composition, there's almost always going to be one thing in particular that will be a big struggle for anyone. Also in like professional game companies, I will mention, and that is overscoping. All the things that can go wrong when you have big ambitions, and it always, like the thing is, it always comes from a good place. It usually comes from a high degree of ambition. You want to make the next World of Warcraft or whatever during the game jam. Anyways, I'm gonna give you some tools on like how to avoid this, but just know that it will likely happen, even if you've been to this presentation and go like, oh, I'm better than this. It will probably happen anyway, so just know it's normal to overscope a game. It's perfectly normal, and it comes from a good place, but there's still some ways to avoid it. I want to highlight that the most important thing to keep in mind when you make a game is just to try to aim for making a game that just works. Solid game design, in my opinion, is way more important than pretty graphics, and I can say that as an artist. Pretty graphics are nice, but it can come later, because the most important thing for everyone on the team is to keep in mind that design is problem solving, and making a game is really hard. It's a lot of problems, but also keep in mind that it requires visual thinking. So, I will try to present some different tools that are really good to keep in mind as you traverse into the game jam. And I want to start with the most basic one in my opinion, and that is just pure game design. In that regard, it's really important to keep in mind that regardless of your role and team size, it's really, really good to brainstorm ideas together. And actually just, whether you make a mind map, like just adding like boxes of text with the genre that you want to work with, like what kind of controls do you want for your game, all that kind of stuff. Try to sync with the entire team on like, okay, how simple do we want to keep it? Usually simpler is better from my experience. Keep it really simple and try to hone in on that. And even like start sketching out like, how does the gameplay look like? If you have a player character, how do they move in this space you're given? Is it a platformer? Is it a 2D game? Is it a 3D game? All these kind of things, when you start sketching it out and you feel like the team is getting somewhere, like everyone can also sit and draw during this time period, I should mention. Like even if you just can draw a stick figure, sitting and drawing together with your team is a way for you guys to visually align on the project you want to make. So yeah. And then there's also things like priorities that I think is super important. And that is to really consider when you make this like game that just works, thinking about what you need to have to make that game work is so important. Like what's the main thing that you need in order just to make your game live, essentially? What does it need? It needs, well, I don't know. I found these images on Google and I think they were just kind of fun. But really consider like, what is the core element to make your game work? Having these priorities also helps avoid overscoping, because all the wants that you might have for your game are also important, but only after the very core part of your game works. As soon as that's in, then you can start to add in all the bells and whistles. So as you are still in the brainstorming phase, think about this, but then as soon as you start to have something that feels like, okay, we're getting somewhere, we have an idea, we feel aligned, let's get to it. As soon as you get to that point, start prototyping. Trust me, it will really make everything so much easier. So that kind of leads me into prototyping, and I like to call it the awkward teenage phase of your game, because this is where you start to add in all the placeholders for things like buttons, like all the user interface elements, also things like sprites, for example, if you need to have that, or like if there's some resource in your game and you want to make it look pretty at the end of the game. Like just add that in, integrate it. If you work in Unity, like try to help integrate those things into your game as soon as possible. Because once you have it in Unity and like the button works, like just at its most basic core, then you can add in the really fancy button that you spent 2 hours drawing or whatever. Thank me later, because as soon as you have added stuff, you can just replace it very easily in Unity, for example. So there are some specific things to keep in mind as a 2D artist, whether you're working on a 3D game or a 2D game. 3D games usually benefit from having at least one 3D artist, in my humble opinion. But as a 2D artist, you can still help a lot by creating textures for the game you're working on. Also things like skyboxes. You might also consider things like buttons, UI elements. That's also something you can help with, or splash screens. 2D games, let's say it's a smaller team, for example, and there's no 3D artist, or you just want to dabble a bit in 2D art. Keep in mind that sprites are usually the biggest potential workload that you can have if you want like animation in your game and a character that does a specific animation when you jump up and down. Sprites, you can always make them a bit simpler if needed, but for 2D games, there's probably going to be a lot of those, maybe. Or also things like backgrounds, like what's in the background. If you make a platformer, you might want to pay extra attention to not making the background stand like too much into the foreground, all that kind of stuff. So these are just some good things to keep in mind as you kind of develop into a prototype. And then I want to talk a little bit on colors. From my experience, colors can be very overwhelming, so sticking to a limited color palette is a really, really huge help. Less is more, as I like to say. There's some different websites where you can have access to color palettes, and you can, of course, Google around and find some nice color palettes. But in my opinion, there's a website called LowSpec that I almost use for every game jam since I first got it as like a little pro tip. And what's really nice about this website is that you can search for specific tags. Like I even tried to put that into this presentation here. So if you want to make a spooky game, then if you search for spooky, then maybe you will get a spooky color palette. And then you can just search a bit for that. It's really nice if you want to make like a kind of retro pixel game. I love using this site a lot. They really have a lot of options to choose from. So whether you want a lot of colors, against my recommendation, or you want to have a few, you can do that. There's also a lot of really nice tutorials on pixel art specifically on LowSpec that I've also used a lot whenever I've been in doubt about how to approach it. And on that note, I wasn't really sure where to fit this in, but I just threw it in there. But for things like art software, it's also good to keep in mind that you might need a specific type of software for that. There's some different options to choose from. If you make a pixel art game, I recommend using Sprite, but you can also use Photoshop with varying degrees of success. I definitely prefer Sprite. But otherwise, there's also free software like Krita that kind of works like Photoshop. You can use that. There's some other options as well, but these are just the ones that I've used personally, so I don't want to recommend something I haven't tried. But just know there's some different options for making pixel art, for example. And on that note, there's some more really cool things to know about colors. And that is, colors have a really nice feature in my opinion, and that is that they can evoke certain emotions and moods as you work on your game. And it can be really fun sometimes to, let's say if you want to make a really cutesy farming simulator that is maybe a bit similar to Fields of Mystery, for example, you can kind of look at the way that they approach colors by making it a bit more pastel-y, but like still very limited color palette when you actually look at it. Like if you were to color pick, there probably wouldn't be as many colors as you expect, but that's like the power of working with a limited color palette in my opinion. And all these examples I included here are all different kind of indie games, and I think indie games are often really nice to look at when you're game jamming, because indie games tends to be, like indie developers really tend to be masters of working with very big limitations, and so you can really look at these games and hopefully get a feeling for like what they're going for. Limbo is a really good example of the game that actually works with like just black, white and gray, and you still know where you're supposed to navigate in that game as it's a platformer. I think just playing into that can be really nice, and these are some really good examples of not so many colors really, and yet still you get a strong feeling for like where they get their inspiration from. I think Pizza Tower is also a really good example of that, because it like clearly plays into like this Ed, and Eddie era kind of cartoon that a lot of people grew up watching. So they just made a game with like a lot of love for that. So play into that. You can also try to subvert the expectations that people might have if you choose, let's say, a really cutesy, fun color palette and make it a spooky horror game. Like you can do that with colors, and it's really good to keep in mind if you want to maybe make a genre of game, but also subvert those expectations for your players. It's super fun. That's also why games are fun, is that sometimes you can go against what people expect from your game just by looking at it. So yeah. Let me see. I'm not sure if I'm going to play this video, but I'm just going to show some examples from the game that I work on for a living, and that is Subway Surfers. And I think I want to use this as an example because colors have a specific purpose in game, or can have a specific purpose in game. And that is to keep in mind that if you want your player to really pay attention to a specific things that they need to pay attention to, whether that's rewards like coins, for example, or things that are an immediate sense of danger that they might smack into and then that's game over. Using colors for that, and using high contrast, bold colors. Like think about poisonous animals that have like danger colors, I like to call. You can kind of play a bit into that with a game. So maybe I'll just play a little bit from one of the updates I worked for on Subway Surfers, just to give you a feeling for what I mean. And for example, what we do in this particular game is that the coins are kind of your guiding information that you need to kind of, you can use it to navigate the level, essentially. And like give you an idea of like, okay, where should I run? We also use the little arrow, for example, on these trains to like make it clear that you can run on top of this. And all these kind of elements are using colors and contrast to make sure that you pay attention where you need to and less attention to where you don't need to. Like for example, all the set dressing you see in the background, it's mostly just to have something to look at if you play for a longer period of time, and like just kind of like background noise almost, so it shouldn't take too much attention away from what you want people to look at when they play your game. And I think I don't really need to show that much more of that, but it's just to give you an idea for like how to use it. And I'm going to continue on to, yes, things like UI or user interface. This is, it's a bit more tricky for me to give a lot of guidance on this, but I still want to highlight some things that are good to keep in mind depending on what kind of game you're making. Because UI covers a lot of things, and I think that could be a talk in and of itself, because like there's people whose entire job is to just figure out like how to make people navigate your game well. And UI is everything from like the buttons that your player needs to use in order to interact with objects, for example, to maybe if you want a tutorial screen before your game starts. That's also good to keep in mind as you have time to work on UI. Do you need that? One of the most, in my opinion, the most important thing to keep in mind if you're unsure of what kind of UI you need is to make people playtest your game. Just try to get some people who are not involved directly with the project to playtest your game. That's a really good way to figure out like what kind of buttons you need, or if you need additional information for making people go somewhere in the game that you want them to go. Having that be part of the tutorial helps a lot. Like maybe you want a big arrow that shows people where they're supposed to go, or kind of like a compass that navigates them towards a certain objective. Using that in your game, and understanding how to make the UI part of that is so important, trust me. I think the ideal here is that your player should be able to navigate the game without you necessarily sitting next to them. That would be the goal, I think, for most game jams, is like to get to that point. And playtesting a lot is a really good way to get to that. And I also want to share some examples of, like, how can you say, I think roughly speaking, there's like different paces for games. And I think, for example, with a game like Super Mario Brothers or Street Fighter, these are good examples of what I like to call fast-paced games. That are games that kind of rely on you having a fast reaction ability to either get to like beat your opponent, for example, really quickly, and like knowing all the combinations and stuff like that. And these games, I think, are a good example of fairly minimal UI. You don't get like a lot of information except for like the most basic things you need to keep in mind. And with Street Fighter, for example, you just see your health bar and your enemy's health bar and maybe a timer, and that's it. You really don't need a lot more information because you just need to think fast, and there's not a lot of time to think about your tactical movement in that sense. Like, it just comes from like mastering the skill of playing that game. And then we have, on the completely opposite side of that spectrum, we have like more turn-based games, and those, at least from my experience, tend to be a bit more heavy on buttons and things to interact with, because you also give your player a lot of time to consider their movements when it's turn-based. Like, you can, there's usually not a time limitation of how long you need to think about your movements, so you can have a lot more buttons, for example, or a lot more resources that you need to keep track of as you like can kind of think about, like, okay, how am I gonna defeat this guy that I'm trying to beat up, for example. All those things will affect the amount of UI you have, so keep that in mind as you work on your game. Is it turn-based, then you can maybe have a bit more liberty to have a lot of stuff going on the screen if you want to like challenge the player to think about what they're gonna do. Or if you make a very fast-paced games, maybe you want less. These are just some good things to keep in mind as you continue. And that kind of leads me to the most important pro tips I want you guys to take away from this talk, and that is really remember to brainstorm together with your team. Sit down, sketch together, and also try to develop with your game and not necessarily have like a preset idea of how it's going to look, because there's a good chance that as you sit down and work on this game that you don't necessarily like can make the things you want to work so well. Maybe it actually kind of sucks, that idea that you had in mind. So adapting those ideas a bit and develop with your game, I think, is a really good takeaway from this. You will probably make a much better game that way. So don't try to fight a specific vision, but kind of let it just let things happen as they go, and also know like when to like maybe go a bit back on track. It's really hard, and like people can spend their entire life making the perfect project, and it's not always you hit it, but you can still aim for that. And like I also mentioned earlier, try to make the prototype as soon as possible, make the core gameplay work, and try to help your program as much as possible with that, using placeholders, all that kind of stuff. It will help a lot. And also the color thing, it's very easy to get lost in the amount of colors, so try to stick to just a few. You really don't need that much just to make a nice, pretty game. And then the most important thing is maybe also, once you have your prototype, just make people play your game, playtest a lot. It will help you so much, trust me. Also playtest other people's game. Maybe that will give you an idea. Try to allow yourself to take some breaks. Let people try your game. Maybe you can try their game. That way you can learn a lot and maybe get inspired by each other. It's a huge help. And yeah, that's basically it. And remember, you also need to have fun. Cool.